Good evening and welcome to the City Talks. This is the final of 4 talks that we've done over the last 4 months on a theme. Every semester the Committee for Urban Studies at the University of Victoria picks a theme and invites speakers to talk, and this is the final 4 now on racism, memory, and the European city. The previous 3 talks have focused mostly on historical questions, on memory and memorialization. And this talk tonight is retrospective but also forward-looking. So it's a nice way to cap that off. The talk tonight is also supported by Global Studies, the Eurpean Union Center of Excellence at UVic, and a number of other units, as well as the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It's great to have Glyn Ford and to have been getting to know him today to address the current state of affairs and the future as well. Glyn Ford's been a member, or was a member of the European Parliament for 25 years. Where he served as both the international trade, on both international trade and foreign affairs committees, particularly on dossiers related to Asia, which is a whole separate area of his work that he won't be focusing on as much tonight. In those capacities, he was responsible for following the free trade agreement with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for the implementation of the scientific partnership agreement with the Republic of Korea. And he was also a shadow spokesman, something I didn't get to ask you about, Glyn, what exactly a shadow spokesman is, on the EU trade agreements with Japan and the Republic of Korea. He was also a member of the delegation with the Japanese Diet from 1984 to 2009, and the delegation with the Korean Peninsula from its inception in 2004 to 2009. After leaving the Parliament in 2009, he founded Poland, a consulting company focusing on European internal politics, international relations, and international trade. He also joined the board of the European Institute for Asian Studies and became a senior associate with the Brussels-led consultancy company G+ Europe. He is a European board member of the Northeast Asian Economic Forum, which is supported by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's an internationally recognized expert on North Korea, to which he has traveled more than 30 times, and he is the author of the book North Korea on the Brink. In addition to all of this central focus of his, he's also, for more than 3 decades, been a leader of efforts both within Europe and the UK to confront and combat racism and xenophobia. And it's that aspect of his career that he'll focus on tonight, and I think we're very lucky to have him here. Welcome, Glyn.
Yes, thank you very much. Can I say I was slightly embarrassed by the introduction in the sense that I'm not talking to you about East Asia or certainly about North Korea, unless you've got some very strange questions at the end of my presentation. I mean, somebody once said, let 100 flowers bloom. Very nice sentiment, but someone's got to do the weeding. And I've spent a lot of my political career actually doing the weeding with some of the rather nastier flowers that have been blooming, if you want, in the body politic. As you were told, I was an MEP for 25 years, from 84 to 2009. And during that period, I've also been treasurer of the Anti-Nazi League in the United Kingdom, whose objectives, I think, are probably self-evident from the name. And I'm on the steering committee of Unite Against Fascism, again, whose objectives are probably self-evident. Because of my activism amongst those 2 groups and amongst a variety of other ones, when I was elected to the European Parliament, we actually, in 1984, we saw the first expression of the extreme right in electoral politics at a European level, in that Jean-Marie Le Pen, leader of the French National Front party, the Front National, got 10 seats. There were 5 seats for the Italian Movimento Sociale Italiano, the Italian avowedly neo-fascist party, and a seat for Eurpean, which was a Greek party in support of the colonel's dictatorship in Greece. They formed themselves into a group called the Group of the Eurpean Right. And so, as a result of that, some of us who had just arrived, like they had, felt we needed to do something. And I found a rather obscure rule in the Parliament's Rules of Procedure allowing you to set up a committee of inquiry if you could get a third of the Parliament to sign a demand. And, well, cut a long story short, we got a committee of inquiry set up, and because it was my idea, I ended up chairing it. So I chaired a committee of inquiry into the growth of racism and fascism in Europe. For 2 years we produced a report, all pretty historical now. I won't go into the details, apart from to say that politicians are politicians. We agreed that we wanted 10 recommendations, a maximum. Unfortunately, there are about 20 members of the committee, and we ended up with 117 recommendations, because everybody had 10 different ones, which was not the idea of the exercise. After that, I actually realised that in a committee of inquiry, the person who's got the power is the rapporteur. That's the person responsible for drafting the report, not the chair. And in 1989, we had a second committee of inquiry into racism and fascism in Europe. And at that point, I was the rapporteur, was responsible for the drafting of the report, which was published. I don't recommend you read it, because it's really ancient history, in a book called Fascist Europe. I continued to be involved, and there were a series of riots in the early 1990s, actually in Germany and France, the result of which was that Kohl and Mitterrand proposed that there be a council of ministers, i.e. at the time the 15 member states should set up a consultative committee on racism and xenophobia to decide what needed to be done. And it was decided that the European Parliament should have a place on this consultative committee, so I spent 4 years on the Council of Ministers Consultative Committee on racism and xenophobia. And through that period of time, we managed to get the issue of combating racism on the agenda. And one of the early demands was that there should be European anti-racist legislation. There had been anti-racist legislation in some member states, including the United Kingdom, but we managed eventually, in about 2005, to get European anti-racist legislation, which has now been extended to anti-discrimination legislation across the European Union. Where do racism and xenophobia actually come from, in a sense? I mean, it seems to me that it's principally triggered, it's an urban phenomenon. This is where it fits in with the demand here to talk about the issue of the cities. Of course you get racism in rural areas. I mean, I'm still active in politics. I represented in the European Parliament the southwest of England in my final 10 years there. And in Cornwall, it's about as white as you can get, and it's very rural, and they have racism. But if you actually look where the fundamental problem lies, it tends to be, if you want, in the urban areas. It's influenced by the shape of the electoral system for various historical reasons, not because the United Kingdom is better than anywhere else, but we actually have, we allow Commonwealth citizens in the United Kingdom to vote in all elections. I understand you used to allow that in Canada. But I guess if you're Canadian, you can come over to Britain and you can vote in any election. But probably more importantly, the large majority of British immigrants from Pakistan and from India can vote. So we have areas in the centre of some of our big cities that are actually inoculated from racism, because we actually have 30 or 40% of the voters who themselves are immigrants. So what we have in terms of city racism is what we call in the white flight areas. In a penumbra around the city where the white population has moved out from the inner city areas. And that's why in London, in the centre, there's not a problem, but in Barking and Dagenham, for example, we had the British National Party with 18 seats on the local council, and I'll come back to the British National Party on another occasion. Some of our northwest cities, places like Blackburn, it wasn't in the centre of Blackburn we had a problem, it was around the edges in what we would call, if you want, the white flight area. It's different in France. In France, most of the immigrants don't get to vote. So there, you actually have, if you want, some of the strongest racism in the inner city areas rather than in the penumbra, places like Marseille and elsewhere. The other element is, if you want, generational support. We have two types of extreme right-wing group. We have what we call the radicals and you have the conservatives. You have the people like the Front National in France would be what I would call national revolutionaries. A radical party. It's changed over time, and we'll come back to some of that. There they have support across the generations, including some strong support amongst young people. In the United Kingdom, our most prominent xenophobic populist, right-wing populist party at the moment is the United Kingdom Independence Party. And that's a socially conservative section of the British Conservative Party in terms of its leadership that's really split off. It's mobilised a lot of potentially Labour voters, it's certainly got a conservative organisation, but there is little support from young people. They're looking for radical solutions rather than, if you want, more conservative solutions to the problem. What drives some of this racism? I mean, it's as much politics and perception as reality. The European Network Against Racism looked at anti-racist attitude, anti-immigrant attitudes in some of Europe's bigger cities. The three worst areas, the three worst cities were Athens, where 17.4% of the population strongly against migrants, Rome 8.5%, and Valletta, the capital of Malta, 4.1%. Now, is this correlated with the number of immigrants? Absolutely not. Athens is number 8 in terms of density of immigrants. Rome is number 16, Valletta is number 19. But there are areas where there are active right-wing parties in Athens, with a whole series of different right-wing extreme right-wing parties. Again in Rome, with some of the descendants of the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the Italian social movement. And in Valletta you have the slightly different problem that Malta is one of the, if you want, the gateway cities where the people who are the refugees and immigrants that are fleeing across the Mediterranean actually end up in Italy, they end up in Malta. Actually, one of the most tolerant cities for immigrants is Tallinn in Estonia, which has got the highest number of immigrants of any European city that was actually surveyed. The consequences of urban racism play out in a whole series of different ways. They play out in the fact that educational spending tends to be lower in areas of high immigration. As a consequence of that, educational attainment is very low as well. Levels of employment are very high amongst the black community, which also comes over, in a sense, also to levels of incarceration as well. And the same with housing standards. It's a second-class or third-class environment in which to live. It also poisons, the tensions poison the local communities and create major, if you want, problems in those community areas with all the consequences that actually follow. Now, back when I first started talking about these issues, I would have to explain to people in Britain that I didn't think this was when the Front National was growing in France, I had to explain to people in Britain that I didn't see this as a French problem. It's not a French problem, it's not a British problem, it's not a Greek problem. And if we want to tackle it, we have to understand it. It's a problem of Western-style democracies, in my view. It goes all the way across the European Union and beyond, into Switzerland, into Norway. You have evidence of it in the United States, in my opinion, with the Tea Party. It's even found in Japan. where you have the Japan Restoration Party, who lost a few seats in the last election, but 5 years ago actually almost became the main opposition party. A deeply nationalist and xenophobic Japanese party, who are some of the people who are involved in, if you want, in the provocations vis-à-vis China with respect to the Senkaku Islands. You could even translate it, if you wanted, not that it's a Western Star democracy, into some of the issues around the Bojilai affair in China. The growth of the extreme right, the Populists, Fascist Right and Fascist Lite, as in Coke Light, it is partly the consequence of the collapse of support for mainstream parties in Europe. It's a reflection, in my view, of the failure of politicians in the face of crisis, voter anger and voter alienation. If one wants to look around Europe, I mean, one of the best ways of doing a summary is probably to look at at last year's European election results. There are 28 member states of the European Union. We have 751 members of the European Parliament. At the last election, something close to 30% of those are extreme right, xenophobic populists that, combined with a much smaller number of, if you want, anti-European far left parties, actually comprises close to a third of the European Parliament. It means, in practical terms, that the European Parliament, which is now the de facto electoral college for the election of the President of the European Commission, can only function at the moment as a grand coalition between the Socialists and the Christian Democrats. And certainly if the far-right parties grow again, well, the far-left parties, although they're growing far more slowly, grow again in the next 5 years, we'll be in a situation where we will have a European crisis, because the European Parliament will become dysfunctional. Now, this is not an accident. Marine Le Pen, the successor of Jean-Marie Le Pen, his daughter, who you may have read about, and Nigel Farage, the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, have both said that that is their objective, to actually stop Europe from working. But it's not just in the United Kingdom and in France. In Germany, at the last European elections, the Alliance for Germany, Eurosceptic, anti-Euro, xenophobic party, not unconnected with Pegida, who I will come on to, actually won seats for the first time. As well as the German neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party, that got a seat in the European Parliament. And again, in recent Länder elections, the Alliance for Germany has made gains. In Italy, in the north you have the Northern League, and in the south you also have the five-star movement of Pepe Grillo. In a sense, slightly more complicated, much more of a populist movement than a far-right movement, though they are involved with Casa Pound, a Holocaust-denying organisation, and certainly fit some of the other criteria. We have Gianfranco Fini, who was the leader of the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the avowedly neo-fascist party, who a decade or so ago changed it into the Alleanza Nazionale, whose mentor was Giorgio Almirante, who was the chef de cabinet of the Minister of Propaganda during the Sala Republic, the one period of, if you want, Italian fascism, was particularly anti-Semitic. They're still around. They're now a post-fascist party. I'm not sure it actually helps the migrants of living in the suburbs of Naples that they're now being beaten up by people with baseball bats who are post-fascists rather than neo-fascists. In Holland you have Geert Wilders, who you may have heard of, who was speaking in Germany last week to 10,000 protesters on behalf of Pegida, which is the anti-Islamic street organisation in Germany. In Greece, you'll have all heard of Syriza, the party in power, the Trotskyist party that actually won the last elections, or didn't quite win. They got within 2 seats of an overall majority. Their success has hidden the growth of the far right in Greece. 20% of Greek voters voted for far-right parties. You have Laos, who was actually 5 years ago in the European Parliament in alliance with the Front National. They have now folded themselves into Nea Demokratia, the Greek Conservative Party. They've become part of the mainstream, not that their views have changed. You also have Anel, the independent Greeks, who are sufficiently publicly minded that they believe you should mine the borders with Turkey to stop illegal immigrants from entering Greece from Turkey. They are now actually in alliance with Syriza, because it's a coalition government of the Trotskyists and the far right, both anti-European, and Anel actually has the Minister of Defence is one of their MPs, and of course you have Golden Dawn, who are probably electorally the most successful of the true Nazi parties. I mean, they're openly Nazi. They have vigilante squads. They're involved in street violence and murder in Greece. And interestingly enough, I mentioned earlier on Eurpean, the colonel's regime. The leader of Golden Dawn actually was the leader of Eurpean's youth group back in 1984, who are actually in the Le Pen group in the European Parliament. In Austria, you have the Freedom Party. Originally became successful under Georg Haider, who once said in Parliament that Hitler's employment policies were better than those of the socialist government. Refused to condemn a terrorist bomb, killing 4 Roma, and got, in the last European elections, 19% of the votes and 4 seats. Hungary, you have Jobbik, anti-Semitic party, who last weekend, for the first time ever, won a seat in a by-election on a first-past-the-post system. They're hoping to be the biggest party in next year's Hungarian elections. And of course, I mentioned France. Since 1983, one of the triggers for, if you want, the success of the Front National was back. This was around the period when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had been thrown out and been replaced by Mitterrand in the socialist communist coalition government, and early in '93 made his U-turn towards austerity. So the population were fed up with, if you want, the right, were fed up with the socialists and the communists, and that's when Le Pen made his first breakthrough in Threar. And from then went on, in a sense, from strength to strength, despite the fact that Jean-Marie Le Pen believes that the Holocaust was a point of detail of history. He repeated it only recently, which is why he's had a spat with his daughter. Believes that the Nazi atrocities in France were exaggerated. Many of those Nazi atrocities were, of course, the murder of Jewish refugees. And actually, back in 1984, they actually elected to the European Parliament a Frenchman who fought with the Waffen-SS under the National Front, under the National Front banner. Despite all of that, Le Pen against Chirac in 2002 got 17.8% of the votes in the presidential elections, came second, eliminated Lionel Jospin, and you had the second round runoff between a right-wing candidate and, if you want, Jean-Marie Le Pen. Actually, interestingly, everybody held their nose, on the left at least, and voted for Chirac, and I think he only improved his vote by something like 0.1% in the second round. Nevertheless, it tells us something. In 2011, Le Pen gave up the leadership of the Front National, and rather like North Korea, it was inherited by his daughter. His granddaughter apparently is next. And she actually got 17.9% in the presidential elections in 2012. In the European elections, got 24.8%. Came first was the first party in France, and in the regional elections only a couple of weeks ago got 25% of the vote. They're expecting her to be the largest party, and certainly finish in the top two in the next presidential elections. What's interesting is changing attitudes. There has been a cordon sanitaire around the Front National to a degree, but in the regional elections a couple of weeks ago, in the second round there were runoffs in many cases between the Front National and the right wing, and between the Front National and the Socialists. The Socialist position was to vote for the right to stop the Front National. The right-wing position was to abstain. But I mean, who's Marine Le Pen travelling with? Actually, she came over to the US not so long ago and met with Tea Party Congressman Joe Walsh and former American Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul. So they do have their links. Le Pen is anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-European, anti-Euro. We have the same, to a degree, in the United Kingdom. We have, in the last 10 years, we've had two right-wing parties. We've had a kind of neo-fascist party, which was the British National Party, led by a man called Nick Griffin, who got 2 seats in the European elections in 2009, and under our first-past-the-post system, which is very difficult to break, managed to get 50-plus councillors elected. They've largely disappeared now. Their members have not been assimilated into the United Kingdom Independence Party, but their voters have, led by Nigel Farage, who recently has got on record saying one of the big problems in Britain is that we're spending too much on treatment for HIV-positive foreigners, and believes that we've solved the problem of racism so successfully in the United Kingdom, we should abolish the anti-racist laws because they're no longer necessary. In 1999, they were 4th in the European elections, won 3 seats. 2004, 3rd, 12 seats. 2009, 2nd, 13 seats. And in 2014, they were the first party in the European elections with 27.5% of the vote and 24 MEPs. So, yeah, that's the situation we have. We have similar problems with the, if you want, the Danish People's Party, the Swedish Democrats got 12.9% of the vote in the last elections, the True Finns, who are now called the Finns, with an election coming up, they're expecting to certainly finish 1st or 2nd in that election on next Sunday. 4 years ago they were 3rd. Part of the difference between some of the parties, and one of the distinctions I made is between the United Kingdom Independence Party and the Front National, is the United Kingdom Independence Party is best known in Britain for being an anti-European party. They're the ones demanding we leave the European Union, demanding a referendum. They are a racist party, and their policy positions are almost impossible to tell from that of the British National Party. But because of their history, they kind of have a reputational shield which helps protect them against the allegations of being a racist party, which is not the same as with the Front National, who's initially known for their racism rather than for their anti-European position, when back in the mid-80s, Le Pen was actually pro-European. It was going to be very much a white Europe, but it was going to be European. But now the position has changed. There are, and I've mentioned on a couple of occasions, Pegida, people, which is an organisation founded in Dresden, which is actually about, if you want, street campaigning and, in some cases, street violence. Certainly the far-right parties in Europe have been associated in the past, and this comes and goes. Certainly in the early days, the Front National, Le Pen himself was convicted of assaulting a Socialist Party election candidate. 4 members of the Front National blew themselves up while trying to put a bomb outside SOS Racism headquarters in Toulon. And when I went to Marseille as part of my committee of inquiry work, I needed the French riot police to actually protect me from the Front National, who were trying to invade the press conference that I was giving. The Italian social movement, the MSI, had links to the Bologna bombing, and even today, some of their successors, there are no-go areas for the left in parts of Italy. And of course, as I mentioned, Golden Dawn, they're involved in a whole series of operations. I mean, Golden Dawn supporters and members actually were part of the Greek volunteer guard who fought with the Serbians in Srebrenica with the ethnic cleansing that went on there. They're certainly heavily involved in the Blue Army, which is the football hooligan gang that actually supports, a very violent one, actually supports, if you want, the Greek national team. And recently they played Albania on two occasions. But Pegida is the patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West. They're xenophobic, they're Islamophobic, and of course, as some of you will know, in January their leader, Lutz Bachmann, was caught posing as Adolf Hitler and forced to, with a Hitler moustache and everything else, and forced to resign. Nevertheless, they could still mobilise 25,000 protesters, which is a lot of people to actually get out on the streets. I understand there was an attempt to organise a march in Montreal, which failed, which I'm delighted about. The British equivalent of Pegida is the English Defence League. Officially not linked either to the British National Party or the United Kingdom Independence Party. There is some overlapping membership, but they try and keep them away. The foot soldiers are primarily football hooligans, and they specialise in picketing mosques during Friday prayers or organising provocative marches through the immigrant areas of Britain's cities. This is one element that feeds into the whole process. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a rising tide of racism and xenophobia. It does go down occasionally, but generally it's been creeping up, if you want, year by year. Initially, the trigger was, in a sense, cultural. There was a reaction to the impact on communities. Initially, it had an impact of affecting and infecting the mainstream parties. My own party, the British Labour Party, of which I'm a member, and a candidate for a local council in the local council elections on May the 7th, which is the same day as the general election, has just produced a series of mugs which we're selling to supporters, one of which says Labour will control immigration. Not entirely clear what immigration they want to control, in the sense that one of the problems at the moment is the allegation about a large number of Bulgarians and Romanians coming to the United Kingdom from inside the European Union. Treaty of Rome allows free movement. We have 2 million Britons living abroad. They benefit from that free movement. We can't stop, if we want to stay within the European Union, the free movement of European Union citizens. Genuine asylum seekers, under the Geneva Convention, we need to deal with those. I guess what we could be talking about is illegal immigrants, but for obvious geographical reasons, I being an island, the number of illegal immigrants that come into Britain is vanishingly small compared to the numbers that go into Italy, into Germany, into, if you want, mainland Europe. The post-war democratic consensus has been broken up, and that's given the space for the xenophobic and ultranationalist forces that were on the political margins to actually grow. Part of this process was the end of the Cold War, which unlocked the historical left-right ideological divisions, which gave them the space. Some of these parties are old, some are new, some are rebranded, some are not. And they actually do move, as you can see with the Front National, move from a very right-wing, xenophobic party with fascists in it to something where Marine Le Pen is trying to portray herself as just another slightly more patriotic party on the right. And the same is true of the Italian social movement, who ended up in coalition with Berlusconi, with Gianfranco Fini as a deputy prime minister at one stage. These parties are trying to recut the political cake. In a sense, class is surrendering to family and faith, race and nation. And this is, in a sense, a threat to the traditional left's working class base. In France, bastions of communism and socialist support in the projects, in the HLMs, have gone over almost en masse to the Front National. Part of the problem is the nature of politics in France. You've got a gentrification of the Social Democratic Party, the French Socialist Party, a centralisation of power. So if you want to be a socialist politician, you have to spend your time in Paris, not on the streets of Marseille, or Toulon, or Vitrolles, or Marignan, or some of these cities that at times have fallen under the control of the Front National. The only people out on the streets are Le Pen's FN. These parties have come out of the margins where they had been suffocated by the traditional left-right divisions, either in terms of first past the post, Labour Conservative, or by groups of parties like in Italy. It's been helped by the fact that the turnout in elections has collapsed. I think it's probably the same in Canada, I don't know, I certainly don't want to try talking to Canadians about what's happening in Canada. But you've seen in Britain, for example, between 1951 and 2010, the participation rate in elections has gone from over 80% to under 60%. That's in general elections. And we're expecting it to probably carry on down on the 7th of May. You've also seen the withering of support for the main parties. In 1951, 96% plus of voters voted Labour or Conservative. The last election it was 65%, and it's probably going to go down even further this time round. Even in Germany, in the first United German election, 77% of voters voted for one of the two main parties. In the last election it was 57%. But these problems, as I've been telling you, affect Greece, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Hungary, the United Kingdom. And they all share certain characteristics. These parties are very xenophobic, very nationalistic, they're authoritarian, and certainly in many cases are quasi-democratic at best, or undemocratic in their internal organisations, and they have charismatic leadership. They're not only anti-immigrant, they're Islamophobic, they're intolerant, they're anti-European, and they're also, in a sense, a contradiction in terms, they're anti-political, anti-politician. And that's been encouraged by some of the antics of, if you want, traditional politicians. And they can deliver between 30% plus and 16% of the vote in most European countries these days. The danger is, one of the dangers, is that some people see them as an opportunity rather than a threat. If one looks at the history of Germany in the 1930s, part of the problem was the socialists and the communists did not unite against the Nazis. They tried to play them off against each other. We have the same problem now. Mitterrand, back in 1986, after the emergence of the Front National, when the Socialist Party was under threat before the 1986 legislative elections, introduced proportional representation and instructed French television to give Le Pen equal coverage. The result was that Le Pen got 10% of the vote, won 35 seats, and got enormous national coverage. Le Pen himself has said this was the breakthrough movement, and this was Mitterrand using a squalid tactical manoeuvre to try and moderate, if you want, the defeat of the socialists in those elections. Of course, Chirac reinstated the old system shortly afterwards, and at the next legislative elections in 1988, the Front National won one seat, but they were still established on the ground. We have the same in the United Kingdom at the moment. There was a premature and immature rejoicing on the left of the fact that the United Kingdom Independence Party was going to siphon enough votes off the Conservatives to let Labour win almost by accident. The view was if UKIP get 15 to 20% of the votes, the majority of that would be from the Conservatives, letting Labour through. They wouldn't win many seats themselves, but that wouldn't be a problem. That is wrong. That is a problem. If you've got xenophobic parties with 15 to 20% of the vote, even with no seats, that is a problem. The difficulty is, in fact, it's not even successful, because while UKIP's leadership may be traditionally conservative, UKIP mobilises a cohort of voters whose socio-economic background should make them Labour. They mobilise those who've lost their way to the ballot box and those that have never found it. The supporters are male, pale and stale, white male pensioners in poverty. Nevertheless, they have an impact. As I said, they're a racist party, but they have a reputational shield. But what we've got to take into account is these parties have not come from nowhere. There's been a fertile soil in communities under stress, whether social stress, or more, which was the first wave of support for the far right, or, if you want, financial stress, where the new austerity measures have hit home. And yes, of course, it was true 10 years ago that part of the argument was they're taking our jobs. It's much more acute now when there are a lot more people unemployed and people are suffering a lot more from reduced public services. But this is not helped by the fact that some of these issues are found close to mass hysteria by sections of the media and parties themselves as they dance together in bigotry, exaggeration and downright lies. So this is the situation as I see it at the moment. What do we do? Well, we need to avoid some of the dangers. We need to avoid the point I made about, if you want, cross-infection, allowing the far right to set the agenda. Labour's immigration mugs, or Jacques Chirac, back when he was confronting Le Pen, who made a well-known speech about people in France being radicaux, full up to the back teeth with the immigrants. His attempt to get National Front supporters back merely, in a sense, legitimated the position of the National Front. So we need to tackle some of these issues head on. The problem with immigration is not, as Mr. Farage says, that they're all relying on our health service. They're actually far less likely to be drawing down public support than the indigenous population. They tend to be young, single, and they go home. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but generally they're actually contributing more to the economy than they're taking out. We need to be very careful not to play games with them. We cannot afford to let them make Europe ungovernable, but there is a danger that some parties will play the game with them. We certainly need to be talking to those on the far left who, in a sense, of course are entitled to a different view, but they just need to be careful who they're travelling with. What worries me is, if you want, the Threar experience repeated. I said earlier about the situation in France when Le Pen made his breakthrough in 1983 with the Threar by-election. People were fed up with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the right. They'd just been thrown out. The communists the Socialist Communist Coalition had just made a U-turn to austerity. People were looking for something else, and the only place to go at the time looked to be the Front National. We have a situation in France where you're likely to get an election coming up between Hollande and Sarkozy, who's going to come back again. The danger is that if Hollande is replaced by Sarkozy, then after that, in the general election that follows, we're fed up with both of them. And we certainly have the same situation potentially in the United Kingdom, where we've had a Tory Liberal coalition government that may be replaced by a Labour SNP coalition, in quotation marks, government in the next few weeks, that actually has the support of probably only 1 in 5 of potential voters. That creates an opportunity after the very short honeymoon, and electoral honeymoons are getting shorter and shorter by the year, to actually see, if you want, UKIP making its breakthrough. What do we have to do? Well, I think firstly we need to organise, we need to educate, and we need to legislate. We need to educate people by exposing these parties for who they really are and what they stand for. Because of course they don't go around saying I'm a racist party, they go around saying actually we think that racism has been so successfully solved we should abolish anti-racist legislation. We need to make sure that people are aware of what they are. We need to address the concerns of the voters. There are genuine problems created by, if you want, internal migration inside the European Union. And part of the problem in the past has been that governments have said, thank you very much, we quite appreciate the taxes that are being paid, and we're not putting any extra money into those communities under stress. We need to make sure that money is put into helping deal with some of those problems, whether it's the short-term problems of education, the health service, or longer-term problems in terms of housing. We need to deal with those problems that people are suffering from. And we also need to mobilise the constituencies under threat. And I'm talking about, if you want, the attitudes of these parties towards women. I mean, interestingly, with the United Kingdom Independence Party, women don't tend to vote for them. But we need to make sure that they come out and vote for somebody else. The migrant communities in Britain need to be aware of the threat. The gay community, I mean, their attitudes are positively medieval towards many of the social groups that have made so many gains in the last few years. So we need to make sure we do that. We need to recognise that working together against them is more important than scoring political points off traditional political parties, which so often we fall into the trap of doing, as we're doing at the moment in the British general election. Thank you.
So we have a good bit of time for some questions. Does someone want to start us out? Yeah.
I must say that I know very little about the European Parliament. I'm not an academic or a student, but I'm curious, is there avenues, is there political bodies, organizations that could be challenging the idea of the European Union, but not being racist and not being xenophobic, or are they all blended together?
Do you want me to do one at a time? Or?
Sure.
Well, I mean, there have been attempts, and interestingly, the man who originally founded the United Kingdom Independence Party, a man called Alan Sked, was taking a kind of anti-European centrist position, which is a perfectly it's not what I agree with, it's a perfectly respectful position to have. The problem was the party got hijacked. I mean, he was the leader, he left the party and now described it as a nasty, racial, racist, Islamophobic party. It's a difficult space to find, but potentially there Yes, there are people that are more sceptical than others. Not everyone's a mad federalist. But yes, I mean, part of the problem is in an era of globalization, the notion that, I'm getting off the point, but the notion that small and medium-sized nation states can go it alone seems to me not to be a very practical possibility, as we can see even here in the United States, where they're trying to do the TPP deal, they're trying to do a deal with the European Union, TTIP, they've got the North American Free Trade Area. There's not much space for small and medium-sized, and when I say medium-sized, I'm talking about the United Kingdom, I'm talking about Belgium, going it alone. So I think there's a political problem there. And one of the wider problems of the growth of these xenophobic nationalist parties, people don't like the realities, and I kind of understand that. I wish you could do it in one country, but you can't.
Yep. A couple. One thing, you haven't mentioned some of the smaller parties that aren't on either polar. I'm thinking of the Greens in particular. Biased opinion, biased thoughts, as like you talked earlier. But just wondering what impact they have towards the whole thing. Is this fragmenting the electoral landscape that much more? Just thoughts towards that as a possibility. And the other thing is, you mentioned first past the post and proportional representation. What are the strengths and weaknesses of those two systems as far as gaining inroads for these extremist parties, either left or right?
Okay. I think, as I said, in a sense it doesn't matter what the electoral system is. If you've got 1 in 6 people voting for an extreme right-wing party, even if they've got almost no representation, you've got a problem. So I don't think it's just about how many seats do they get. It may be that first past the post actually slows their growth because they don't get the early returns that they can get with proportional representation. The weakness of first past the post, I would argue, is probably demonstrated by the United States, where you have the first past the post in its most bizarre manifestation, where it's almost impossible for anyone to get elected, and people are spending $15 million to become dog catcher. But that's a whole different debate. But I mean, that is problematic. The problem with proportional representation makes it people get who they want to vote for. The trouble is, it doesn't change the government, in the sense that you've had the situation in parts of Belgium where, if you want, the two major parties have been in every government for the last 40 years. You can't get rid of them, because the only way it adds up, yes, some of the smaller parties come and go, some grow, some shrink, whatever. So yes, you get your Green elected, but it doesn't change the government, it doesn't really change the policy. So that seems to me to be the problem. You asked about the Greens. Yes, I mean, you do have on the left, or the progressive side of politics, or you want, some growth, and the Greens have actually done rather well in places like Germany, and they've probably got an electoral presence in quite a large number of European Union countries now, but compared to the growth of the xenophobic extreme right, they're really doing rather badly. We're having a debate at the moment in Britain about the growth of small parties and how they're going to have an impact on the election. They're going to have an impact on the election, but they're not going to have an impact, in a sense, on the government. Because I suspect that Plaid Cymru, which is the Welsh nationalists, the Greens, and probably UKIP in the general election, will get 10 seats between them because of our first past the post system. That doesn't mean to say we don't have a problem, as I said earlier, but yes, you've got that. You've got a fragmentation of politics, and I'm a Labour Party member. That's not a problem. The problem is that it's, in a sense, it's not fragmenting enough. You're getting the growth of new xenophobic, right-wing, nationalist and populist parties. And they are the threat, in my view, not only in Europe, but further afield as well.
I think I saw a question here. Yeah,
If you look at communities where you see less tension around immigrants or fewer acts of racism or racist violence, I think you mentioned Estonia at the beginning of your talk. Do you see something going on there that is different from other communities?
I'm not an expert on immigration in Estonia. Let me make it very clear. I suspect that the nature of the immigration is very different. This is not where you're getting, part of the problem, and this is a whole different debate, is about, if you want, Islam. And in a sense, the Front National started off as very much an anti-Semitic party. I quoted Le Pen about the Holocaust as a point of detail in history. And certainly organisations like the British National Party were also anti-Semitic. But that doesn't work very well. It does work for a few people. What works far more successfully and is much better lever, certainly since 9/11, has been Islam and the Muslims. And that is the lever that's been pushed, in a sense, very hard. It used to be there was a problem in Britain with racism against Afro-Caribbeans. They're certainly not free of the problem of racism, but the real day-to-day racist problems are with Muslim communities and the white communities around them, rather than the Afro-Caribbeans who are going often to the same churches, or at least a different church, where it's the Muslims going to the mosques and everything else. So that's one of the tensions, and one of the things we've done reasonably well is living together with the Afro-Caribbean community. The issue with the Muslim community is much more difficult. And certainly I was a chair of an education committee in Manchester before I became a member of the European Parliament. We had a real problem with some of the issues that came up about wanting to have single-sex girls teaching in the secondary schools, halal meats, girls being allowed to wear Islamic dress. So there are a whole series of problems around those kind of issues that were very difficult to tackle and to deal with.
There was someone over here.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment a bit on the nationalism of the immigrant communities and some of the racism that's developing there, anti-Zionist movement, and even in France, they find out a lot of the immigrant community actually votes for the National Front, if I'm correct.
Well, firstly, let me say that the immigrant community is not immune from its own racism. That's certainly true. And in the past, I've been given magazines by Muslims in the community I was representing that had reprinted in as an ongoing serial part of the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. So you have to try and say, hang on, no, hang on, there's a problem here. And that's sometimes not easy to explain, so you do have those kind of problems. Part of the problem is as a result of, if you want, the communities being apart for whatever reason. You're now seeing, and I mentioned, I think, levels of unemployment, incarceration, educational attainment, all of that, disadvantaging those communities who are deeply alienated, as are some of the white population as well, for different reasons, and are now being attracted to radical Islam. So yes, you are getting some of the young people, and in the United Kingdom, we've had cases recently of young girls and young men going to Syria to want to fight with ISIS. And you've seen with the issue around Charlie Hebdo in France, some of the same things happening there. So there is a radicalisation. Part of the problem is we need short-term measures, and I certainly accept the legislation that's trying to stop people from going to fight with ISIS. But at the same time, we need to look at some of the longer-term solutions to reintegrate those communities back into the wider whole. Because unless we do that, the problem is going to continue and get worse.
There was a question all the way in the back there, so.
Yeah, I've been noticing that, I was just watching the television coverage of your elections in England, and it's reminding me of ours in Americans, is that mainstream politicians can't say anything. They don't want to offend anybody, so they're saying, they're talking in oblique language that means virtually nothing. But the people on the right are using these rousing speeches that mean things and getting people agitated to vote. And the mainstream people, because today they're talking, your Labour leader was eating a pie wrong. And that was...
Bacon sandwich.
Bacon sandwich and how to eat a pie. You know, do you eat a pie with your hands or do you do it with a knife and fork? I mean, that's Jon Stewart and eating pizza in New York. That's not politics. So if the mainstream parties aren't giving a message that people will respond to, someone else will.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree. I mean, my party would consider me to be rather outspoken, maybe why I'm no longer a member of the European Parliament. But yes, I think politicians do have to be prepared to tell people things they don't like. And I do have a view. I mean, you don't have to take pleasure in it, but yes, you have to be real about things. You can't spend more than you take in. So if people want more social services, they have to be paid for. It's very easy to promise maintenance of social service, improved social services and tax cuts. It doesn't work. You've got to be honest with people. And I believe that if you are honest with people, they will respect you. The danger is, well no, I mean there's a danger that, yes, I'm sure my party leader is saying, yeah, I've got to tell them that, but not this week, 3 weeks before the election. All parties are telling lies at the moment. We're going to have further cuts in Britain. And everybody's saying, no, we don't, it's fine, we can carry on, we'll be fine, we can spend more money. Not unless you start raising a lot more money.
But there's this blandness now in politicians that they don't want to make a big mistake, or so there's no they're losing their popular support because they're not saying anything. That's what
well, and the other advantage the far right parties have got, they can say anything they want because they don't have to implement it.
That's right.
I mean, I'm not defending, certainly here, if you want the attitude of the British parties in this election. But I mean, people go through comparing the manifestos. Do the numbers add up? There's only two parties that have got to worry about the numbers adding up. You're either going to have a Labour majority government or a Conservative majority government. And the fact that UKIP are promising to increase defence spending and increase this and increase that, they are not going to be in power. Now, they may have some influence, they may have an impact on the election, but that is not the reality. And the media are treating everybody's manifesto as the same. Actually, there are two real manifestos you have to worry about, and everything else is noise off.
Right.
Yeah.
Just picking up on your point about the media there, to what degree is the media, or does the media giving these parties that are not necessarily legitimate in terms of, they have very extreme ideas, what role does the media play in almost legitimizing them by giving them a voice?
Well, I mean, yeah, we don't, I mean, I'm sorry, I tend to use British examples because I'm British, but I mean, we don't have a very free media. We have Rupert Murdoch, who I guess most of you have heard of, and controls a large section of the media, and he's got his own agenda. I mean, he's anti-European, primarily because the one thing that scares him is actually Europe could probably put some controls over its press empire, but the United Kingdom on its own probably couldn't. We have another man who's just given a media proprietor who runs 4 daily newspapers, well, 2 daily newspapers and also the Sunday versions of them, the Express and the Star, who's just given today £1 million to UKIP. Now that sounds like small change in North American terms, but when you, actually, the total spending of political parties in the election will probably be 30 million. So he's a press proprietor who's given £1 million to one of the parties when he's supposed to be kind of neutral in the election. And not even a mainstream party. So, I mean, we do have a problem. I mean, social media kind of helps, but yes, we have difficulties. At least in Britain we don't, and in Europe generally, we don't have the problems that they have down south of here, where an election costs $1 billion, and that's just to be the candidate.
Yeah. You mentioned in your response a couple of questions ago the need to integrate the minority groups. Could you also answer the question perhaps as to why it's been so unsuccessful, why efforts to assimilate have been so unsuccessful in the past, or have they simply not been made? For instance, in France, even if a Muslim student gets a degree from a university, the chances of employment is less than half what it would be were he a non-Muslim student. The fact of the matter is there seems to be next to no success in integrating many of these immigrant populations into normal life of the various countries of Europe. And when we look at it from outside, it's a real puzzle. Why is it that so little has been done up to now to deal with the underlying causes of some of this alienation?
Okay, well, I mean, part of what was done was some of the anti-racist legislation, because you did have, I mean, and yes, we still have a situation where if you want the migrant, the black community, it's got far lower employment rates. It's far more difficult for them to get to university. When they get to university and get through it and they get a degree, it's far more difficult for them to get a job and the rest. Some of the anti-discrimination legislation stopped, if you want, companies and organisations from systematically discriminating against them, which was to remove some of that inbuilt disadvantage. Now that's part of the legislation, and there's the education argument about actually educating businessmen and women that you're missing opportunities by not employing more women, more ethnic minorities, because they're actually bright, intelligent, and can bring something to your business. Part of the problem, in a sense, with the Muslim community has been the fact, well, it's on both sides. There's been not an attempt to integrate. It's been too easy to allow them to get into ghettos, and they themselves, because of social attitudes, of not wanting to engage in the same way. As I said, there was a real problem for me when I was Chair of Education in East Manchester about demands from the Muslim community for different treatment for women, and in terms of things like school meals. They wanted to be... I tried to avoid isolating the community, because what they wanted is to have separate places to eat. And I didn't allow that. I made it compulsory that it was a vegetarian option in every school meal. So you didn't need to have halal meat with everything that implies. They could go and eat with everybody else. There was a vegetarian option. I changed the school uniform regulation so that all girls could wear trousers. So we didn't have special rules for Muslim girls. But it's far too easy to slip into, Muslim girls can be treated differently. No. But no, I mean, I wish there was an easier option. I mean, and to be fair, in France, where they've made more effort at assimilation, they still clearly have their problems.
Could you talk a bit about Ukraine? Canada is joining us in Britain in training, well, we don't know who we're training exactly, but just about what's the situation in Ukraine in terms of far-right parties. I think, myself and other Canadians are worried about the kind of people that we're training and just what's going on.
Well, yeah. Somebody mentioned, I think earlier, about about Turkish membership of the European Union. It wasn't here. Turkey is now behind the Ukraine in the queue to join the European Union, because if you want, the Ukrainians are part of Christendom, which the Turks aren't, so they're fine. I'm a bit worried about the Ukraine myself. I mean, Ukraine was a deeply polarized society between, if you want, the western half and the eastern half, one group looking towards Moscow and the other group looking towards Brussels. And all of this was triggered by, if you want, the EU-Ukraine trade agreement, which was about to be signed, and then there was heavy pressure and you've got all of the protests on the Maidan. I certainly don't claim to know all the ins and outs of the situation, but there are some pretty unpleasant groups and organisations on the Maidan. Not all of the protesters, but there are some pretty unpleasant neo-Nazi fascist groups there. And certainly the evidence suggests that the firing at people on the Maidan was coming from more than one direction. I'm not a fan, but the British government is announcing the same, that we're going to be sending in trainers, army trainers, to help train the Ukrainian armed forces to be better able to resist, if you want, the Eastern Ukrainians and the Russians. I'm not a fan. I was not a fan either of our intervention in Libya or Iraq, though if you want to go into it, I did support the intervention in Afghanistan. But yes, and Syria, I think military intervention by the West has contributed to some of the problems that we're actually facing, which is why some of the Muslim community feel so alienated, because they do see it as, if you want, special pleading by the West that we're treating everybody equally, when attitudes towards, if you want, some of the, towards the Middle East can be so polarized.
I have a couple of questions to follow up on things. So one is following up on a comment you made with respect to first past the post systems. So I wonder if you could talk further about the nature of the problems that might exist when 20% of the population is voting for racist, xenophobic parties, but not finding representation. Are there examples that come to mind for you? What's the nature of that problem? How does it differ from a context where they would have some small voice within a parliamentary system? So that's one question I have. The other is just going back to maybe one of the first questions. I think maybe the first question. I wonder if you could comment on the reasons for the intersection between anti-European Union positions and racist positions. Why would those two views be so closely intertwined?
Okay. To try and, I take the view that if you've got a large block of the population that are unrepresented, or even if they're represented in a small way, and they're completely isolated, you then start having problems out on the streets. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had riots in London triggered by the police treatment of a black youth, which did tens of millions of pounds worth of damage. If you've got 20% of the population that genuinely believe in some of this stuff, then it has consequences in terms of attitudes on the ground. Certainly, there were figures from when the BNP were elected, British National Party, when they stood for election, got good votes, racist incidents, racial attacks, and even racial murders went up in those areas. So you cannot isolate the voters from day-to-day life. So I think there's a danger there. The issue is how one controls that. So you've got those problems with first past the post. PR can be just as bad. I mean, again, if you've got 20% of the population voting, you get a reflection on the ground. And certainly, if you look at some of the far right parties, when they're being electorally successful, they tone down their street violence. When they're going through an electoral bad patch, there's factions inside the party that start arguing for, if you want, back on the streets. So you get this toing and froing. It's the same. It was the same in a very different sense in Britain with the trade union movement. When Labour was doing well, the trade union movement thought they could solve their problems through the party. When Labour's doing badly, you tended to have more wildcat strikes and militant action in the factories and on the streets. So I mean, it's a a pure reflection like that. The intersection of anti-racism and anti-EU. I mean, in a sense, anti-racism is anti-foreigner. And one element of the anti-racist attitudes, at least in the 15, the original, before we enlarged to the East, is that some of the people they resent are the Eastern Europeans. And one of the big issues, as I mentioned in passing, is, if you want, Romanians, Bulgarians are coming to Britain, because we had a 7-year transitional period after they joined. They've only been able to come to the United Kingdom unrestricted since the 1st of January last year. And so there's been this myth that they're going to be absolutely flooded by hundreds of thousands of people coming in and stealing our jobs. Turned out not to be true. Some of the newspapers reported every plane from Romania is full. There's dozens of buses leaving every day, and someone went in investigating it's not true. But there's this image that you've got the Romanians and Bulgarians. So if you don't want immigrants, then in the sense you've got to be anti-EU. Because one of the founding principles of the European Union is free movement of goods, services, capital and people. And you can't have the first three without the fourth, or some people would like it, but that's part of the Treaty of Rome. So if you don't like foreigners, if you're xenophobic, it's difficult to be part of a wider union that has a free movement provision in it. I think that's the essential part of the argument. And there's also the issue about lack of control, sovereignty. If you're a nationalist, you're about sovereignty. Well, you've got to pool sovereignty to make decisions at a European Union level. You can't. There's 28 member states having to make decisions together, which means that sometimes the decision is made you don't agree with. Now, I think you gain a lot from that. You gain more than you lose, but not everybody takes the same argument. And we want to make our own decisions about this. Fine. Consequence is that you have to do it on your own.
Now, you're also an anti-racism activist. Can you think of any successful grassroots movements, citizen-driven movements, that would be effective in combating racism? As you said, politics is not always the answer. So,
I mean, the problem is you've got to refight this battle sort of every 12 months, every 18 months. I mean, certainly in France, back when Le Pen emerged for the first time, there was a movement I mentioned called SOS Racism, which had a slogan, "Touche pas mon pote," don't touch my mate. And that was very powerful for a period. It could mobilise 1 million people demonstrating in Paris. That's the biggest audience I've ever spoken to. But you don't fight racism once and you've won. You need to refight it, and you need to refight it in different ways. I mean, 20 years ago, we were very good at isolating some of these parties by exposing their neo-Nazi links. You have lots of pictures of some of these guys wearing quasi-Nazi uniform, doing Nazi salutes and celebrating Hitler's birthday. They've woken up to that. They don't do that anymore. I mean, occasionally you catch someone like the head of Pegida doing it, but you don't have the same easy options. It's fascists in lounge suits now. They're not in their leather jackets and leather coats. So you have to constantly refight this battle. So there are things that work at one time that don't work again. One of the problems I've got in terms of the work I'm doing in Unite Against Fascism is we haven't been capable of moving on in that sense. I mean, as I said, there are no easy answers. But you cannot use the same set of argumentation against UKIP you can use against the British National Party. Nick Griffin is a close friend of Roberto Fiore. Roberto Fiore is a terrorist wanted for a terrorist bombing in Italy. Pictures of the two together are very powerful. Nigel Farage doesn't do that. And you can't use the same arguments, and you don't have the state. So, yes, you need to constantly find new ways of fighting the battle as they find new ways if you want presenting themselves.
Yeah, maybe a final question here, sir.
To what extent do you think the pressure from refugees coming from war-torn countries and the impoverished countries in Africa is driving some of the racism problems that you're describing? Because
I mean, it's certainly driving it in terms of perception. I mean, because the perception is, if you ask people how many refugees are coming in, they have fantastic numbers. I mean, to be fair, if you're in Italy or if you're in Germany, you've got serious numbers. In Britain, because we're an island, because of the Dublin Convention says you can only apply for asylum in the first country you enter. Well, there are no direct flights from Libya to Britain. So if you're a Libyan refugee, you get on a boat and go to Italy. You don't end up in Britain. But so there is a perception which is driving some of this. And to be fair, in some of the Mediterranean countries, there is more of a reality. Yes, they do have hundreds of thousands of sub-Saharan Africans that have come through Libya, increasing numbers of Libyan refugees, Albanians, whatever. So there are problems, but they're not problems in Britain because they don't get that far. But yes, if you ask the average person, there's thousands of them a day coming. I mean, we have the classic problem of Calais. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there's a large number of mainly African, sub-Saharan, English-speaking African refugees in Calais in a camp, and they're constantly trying to get to the UK. It's a big story in the British press, but actually very few get in. It's very difficult. You've got to get on a lorry, you've got to get across 22 miles of water. Some years ago I was in Spanish North Africa. There's two African enclaves, two Spanish enclaves in Africa, in Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla. The border at the time in one of them was a roll of barbed wire across the top of a garage. It's rather easier to cross that than 22 miles of water.
I want to thank Ford for the presentation today and also this evening. Thank you all for coming. I think it's been a disturbing picture that you've drawn for us, but I think an important one also, and one that merits our attention. So thank you. I'll thank the audience also. Look for the City Talks again in September. And until then, your time is yours.